Okay, hello everybody. I'm very excited about this topic. My name is Ujwal. I'm the co-founder and CEO of MotivBase. I'm also a cultural anthropologist. And we are gathered here today to talk about the issue of plant-based everything, plant foods. This is a topic that is not only front and center in the media today, but obviously is highly important for numerous industries across numerous markets. And, it is also one of those topics that seems to be talked about so much that, people fear whether there is, in fact, a bit of a bubble around this issue. And that is what we will address today. Before I actually go into the results of our research, our big data ethnographic research on the topic and talk about the demand spaces within it and some of the opportunities and threats, I will start with a bit of an introduction and provide a bit of background so you have a sense of who we are and why we do what we do. So just by way of introduction, my name is Ujwal. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I live and breathe immersive ethnographic research. My company is MotivBase, one of the first companies in the world, and actually the only company in the world that has found a way to take the art and science of observational ethnography and apply it to the online world, to big data. But I'll start with our why. Our mission as an organization is to help leaders and future leaders in companies transform their businesses from one that is industry-led to one that is consumer-led and empathetic. What does that mean? We will talk about numerous examples of that. But just fundamentally, what we find is that we all tend to describe and define our industries and as a result define the parameters around our businesses and guide senior leaders, middle management around industry-led parameters. So for example, plant-based is a classic example of an industry-led parameter. Now, what does plant-based really mean to the consumer? What is the consumer-led interpretation of plant-based? That's what we're going to talk about over the next 25, 30 minutes. But this is a classic narrative. And, one of the first companies we worked with in this plant-based space was a major protein player in the United States. And, the reason they brought us in was because they had created a division focused on plant protein. And they told us it wasn't performing as well as they wanted it to. That's a classic example because it was an example of an executive team creating a division based on an industry definition of something, as opposed to really thinking about what is it that the consumer wants and how do we define and create a division that adheres to the consumer's needs and as a result opens the door to real innovation, real problem solving, addressing white spaces, and obviously, having and reaping the benefits of powerful innovation. So that's really what we'll talk about today, and you'll see that come to life in the plant-based example. Now, the way we do this as an organization, the way we help companies go from an industry-led lens to a consumer-led lens is by applying observational ethnographic research to big data using artificial intelligence. And that's really what we do as a company. We are a team of anthropologists, and we apply observational ethnography to big data. And to do that, we use artificial intelligence, and we've actually built an AI anthropologist that does the work for us, that leverages big data in the form of consumer conversations on the internet to perform observational ethnography the same way an anthropologist would in field. Now, again, before I dive into the results of the research, I do want to give you a quick example of how is it that our technology is able to do this, just so you understand the power behind the insights you're about to see. The biggest issue we had to solve for as anthropologists is the issue of context. It wasn't enough to have a machine just go and scrape conversations about something. We had to create a machine that understood context specific conversations, so conversations that were happening in a given context. So let me give you a classic example. Let's say let's say an anthropologist is observing a dinner table conversation amongst a group of people about plant-based foods, let's say, and somewhere along that conversation, let's say one of the people goes on a random tangent that has nothing to do with plant-based foods, and it just reminds them about something funny their kid did at school, let's say. In that example, the anthropologist would put down their pen and paper when that story is told, because they know this has nothing to do with the context being discussed. And then, of course, when the conversation goes back into the discussion of plant-based, the notebook is back up and the anthropologist is observing and taking notes and trying to understand what kinds of contextual meanings are being created. We had to create a machine that could emulate that. And that's really the fundamental piece of intellectual property that we had to build that enables us to do observational ethnography at scale and to discover demand spaces through a consumer-led lens, which is really what you're going to see when we dive into the plant-based example. So let me just give you a tangible example just to bring this all together into how we're doing this form of research. In front of you is a real example of a conversation about fermented foods amongst 5 people. Okay, I just want to show you what contextual intelligence really means in the context of big data here. Let's say our goal was to study the culture of fermented foods. A traditional analytics engine would take this post and maybe this post into account because they specifically mentioned the terms fermented, and they would ignore the responses from the other 3 people in this discussion because they didn't specifically mention the term fermented or fermented foods, even though they were having contextual conversations about the topic. So if the purpose is just analytics, but because here the purpose is observational ethnography, we had to help our machine understand that, no, these conversations from person number 2 and person number 3 and person number 5 are in context, even though they don't use the terms fermented foods. And as a result, our machine is not only able to understand which conversations are contextual and non-contextual, but because it's able to understand context, it's able to understand the way in which human beings inadvertently, just through organic conversation, inadvertently give meaning to the term fermented. So for example, if people talk about sauerkraut or ginger beer or kefir or kombucha, through these conversations, they're giving meaning to what fermented foods means to people in their lives. And they're creating a mental model around the culture of fermented foods. Now, here's where the benefit of big data comes into play. Because we're scraping, I'm just showing you an example amongst 5 people, we're scraping data out amongst hundreds of thousands of consumers, if not millions of consumers actually on a day-to-day basis, millions of conversations. And because you're able to quantify these contextual relationships, you're able to understand if, for example, the term morning is more relevant to fermented foods than the term evening. And if it is, that means something to the culture of fermented foods. And that's really the power of big data and large N samples when applied to contextual intelligence. It can give an anthropologist a tool that otherwise would be unavailable. And with this tool, an anthropologist is able to, and this is the key, quantify the results of an ethnography. And that's what we're going to take you through today in the context of plant-based foods. Okay, so the results you're about to see comes from data collected from more than 100,000 unique individuals who discussed more than 400,000 topics in the context of plant-based foods over the course of a year. And we're going to analyze that, and we're going to give you a sense of where the culture is headed, what's driving it, and what the pressures, positive, negative are, and where the opportunities lie. So let's start with an overall lay of the land. We'll first talk about where plant-based, the culture of plant foods, where is it headed? First of all, you'll notice that, and this all comes from our technology, MotivBase. First of all, you'll notice that the culture itself is relevant to a fairly small group of people. I won't go as far to call it niche. It's not niche. It's 41 million people, 42 million people. That's pretty large in the United States. So this is US data. But it's not 100 million people. And it's not growing by 80% or 60% as the industry data seems to show. Instead, it's growing at a nominal 4.5% over the next 2 years. And that's all right. What that's showing us is that clearly this is of value to a smaller group of individuals, but it's powerful. It's got a ways to go in terms of clearly maturing. It's just entering the early majority phase in terms of its maturity. So people don't clearly understand what this means or should mean to them in their lives. And that maturity is slowly growing. And it's also teaching us that, okay, so there's about 4.5% growth. So, this is a culture that is expanding, but it's not expanding exponentially as industry reports might suggest. So if we see that data, the question becomes, okay, so what forces are affecting this? Why isn't plant-based foods becoming the next big thing? Or why isn't it growing at the rate that the industry seems to think it is? Because there are some forces that are for it, and there are some forces that are against it. But these are the major demand spaces. There are 5 major demand spaces driving this landscape, and there are 2 demand spaces that are positive and 2 demand spaces that are negative. 3 demand spaces that are negative. So I want to deconstruct these over the next little while. We'll start from the left with the demand space of quality of meat, and we'll slowly go to the right. And we'll identify what these demand spaces mean through a consumer-led lens, and we'll help you understand what that means for the plant-based universe and for its future. So first of all, quality of meat. Why is that a positive to the plant-based universe? Because the concern over the quality of meat is quite predominant in this culture of plant-based, and that shows us that one of the reasons consumers are gravitating towards plant-based is because there is a growing concern of the quality of the meat they get from their typical sources, typically grocery stores. And in particular, when I say quality, what the consumer is really concerned about is the issue of animal feed and how that affects their health. Quite interesting. But again, this is not earth-shattering in the sense that it's growing about 5% a year. So it's not, something that is taking over this landscape. So it is something that is assisting in people's interest in plant-based. But it's not the only reason, but it is a positive driver. Again, relevant to about 38 million people, growing to about 40.5 million people over the next couple of years. Now, the interesting thing is that this concern over the quality of meat isn't just about beef or pork. It also extends to fish, and in particular, farming mechanisms or farming systems. And this is quite fascinating because this is showing us some of the vulnerabilities and concerns that consumers have around meat and obviously, fish that they're buying. And, obviously farming techniques plays a big role, and there's concern about impact to human health. And that is driving the demand for plant-based. So that is demand space number 1. So again, demand space number 1, relevant to a smallish group of people, growing nominally, is certainly having a positive impact on plant-based. Let's go to demand space number 2, which is gut health. This is fascinating because this is a demand space that is growing at a massive rate. It is actually doubling over the next year because people are seeing gut health benefits from eating plant-based foods, which they're not seeing obviously from eating traditional proteins, animal-based proteins. So this is interesting. Currently just entering the early majority phase, massive projected growth, both in maturity and core market size. And that's showing us that this is a huge opportunity space in the plant-based universe, and certainly one that's emerging, certainly one that requires a whole deep dive in and of itself to explore the culture and the relationship between gut health and plant food, of course. But this demand space certainly is an important one to watch out for. And it also relates to another demand space that is much smaller, but also emerging and also growing at about 11.5%, which is more broader digestion and stomach-related benefits of eating plant-based foods. And again, this one is a little more niche and a little more early, still in the early adopter stage, not growing as significantly as gut health. Obviously, gut health has a bit of a halo around it, and certainly has its own culture and its own trajectory. But we are seeing the two interrelated and, of course, important positive driving forces for the growth of plant-based foods, and certainly critical demand spaces. Now, the interesting thing is we're not seeing a lot of major plant-based suppliers investing in this space just yet. So certainly huge opportunity opening up that certainly holds a lot of future potential. Let's go to demand space number 3. If you recall, when we started this, I talked about how these 2 demand spaces have a positive impact on the plant-based universe, and these 3 have a bit of a negative impact on the plant-based universe. And it's the 2 acting against one another that is driving the sort of nominal growth in the overall plant universe. So now let's talk about some of those negative demand spaces. We'll start with this one, adequate nutrition, demand space number 3. What does that mean? It means consumers are concerned about becoming nutritionally deficient if they eat plant-based or if they reduce their meat intake. Now, of course, the lead consumer here, the consumer who's sort of driving the culture, both for or against, but driving the culture, is obviously a lot more educated. They're talking about a lot of very specific things. When this thing matures, mainstream consumers are not going to be talking about specific things, whether it's, omega-3s or vitamin D or C or A or what have you, but they're just going to have that mental model in their minds that says, oh, there's an issue of nutritional deficiency with plant-based. And that's really what this is creating in terms of that negative impact on plant-based. Growing by 40%, that's massive. Entering early majority, again, starting to have an impact. But again, the projected growth hitting about 50 million people, that's a significant negative impact, significant impact of a demand space that is going against the plant-based universe. Of course, a lot of our clients sit on both sides of the aisle. They have investments in animal, investments in plant. And of course, what this shows them is opportunity areas that can be leveraged on both sides for different kinds of innovations. But fundamentally, the demand space that is negative towards plant-based here is about nutritional deficiency. And then if we were to dig in or double click into that area, there's some interesting things going on there. There's some specifics that are discussed. B12, vitamin A, calcium, omega-3s, and DHA tend to be the most common specific nutrition concerns that consumers have. I'm just showing you a few examples of that. B12, for example, growing at about 30%. Concern for vitamin A growing at about 113%, massive. It's just really, really interesting because it just shows us how the consumer is really thinking about this, but it all dovetails towards a broader concern about plant-based making one nutritionally deficient. Again, I'm speaking about this through a consumer lens. This is not about whether this is technically true or not. From a scientific lens, we all know that there's no such thing. I mean, it depends on what you put in your body. But the point of this is, point of the consumer lens is to get into the mind of the consumer to understand what sits in their mental model. It doesn't matter whether it's logical or not. What matters is that this is what shapes culture and shapes the future of an industry. And if we don't get on board, then we're constantly, sort of beating a dead horse, if you will. Seems like a horrible analogy in this context, but it applies. So now let's go on to the next demand space, pesticide use. So again, quick reminder, we talked about the positive demand spaces. Now we're talking about the negative demand spaces. We talked about quality of meat, gut health, nutrition. Now we're getting into demand space number 4, pesticide use. As you may have guessed, the problem of pesticide use isn't just about animal feed. It also applies to plants that people consume. If people are now going to consume more plant-based foods, they're now going to increase their concern about the consumption of pesticides and also seek organic alternatives. So on one hand, along with plant-based foods comes an increased interest in organic alternatives that people are seeking. So the two do go hand in hand, but the reason for that is the consumption or the concern over the consumption of pesticides. However, this is still in very, very early stages, still in the early adopter stage. This is not one of those negative demand spaces that is transforming this industry overnight. It's going to take time, but it is coming and it is growing. The other interesting thing is it's also related to an increased awareness about what the consumer calls organic pesticides, so the concern over the use of or the approval of pesticides to be used in organic farming, which again adds to the consumer's concern that even organic is insufficient or not good enough. So again, some interesting issues developing in this landscape that are posing interesting threats to the plant-based landscape, and also obviously opening the doors to some interesting opportunities. We are seeing opportunities, parallel opportunities in the space of vertical farming, indoor farming, and so on and so forth, which is a bit out of scope here. I'm not going to get into that, but very interesting related trends that are developing because of all these forces developing in the plant-based universe. The last demand space is one of lab grown. So again, why is this a negative demand space in the context of plant-based? Because it shows an increased interest awareness amongst consumers about cultured and lab grown meats. It is still quite immature, and it's not growing at 80% or 100% like some of the demand spaces we saw, but it is growing by about 6%. It's going to be relevant to about 30 million people. So again, when we talk about relevancy, this doesn't mean that 30 million people are buying. It means 30 million people are engaging on this topic. They understand this. They're seeking information. They're open to it. And that shows us the market potential for something, or the maximum market potential for something. So this is showing us that it's still in early stages, but there is a growing interest in it, but it's still in nascent stages, and it's not certainly something that is going to overtake the marketplace overnight. But it is certainly something that is adding to the negative impact on the plant-based universe. Okay, so let's start to put all of this together. What does this really mean for us? It means a few different things. On one hand, again, let's think about this purely from the perspective of the plant-based universe, which we started and focused on for this analysis. There's some interesting opportunities and some interesting threats. Some of those opportunities are more short-term and immediate because they offer high growth potential. They also offer higher core markets, as in more and more people are willing to listen, willing to care about this topic, willing to engage on this, which means the market potential for something is expanding. So let's talk about some of those opportunities first. So on the opportunity side, gut health, major one. If you recall, and I'll jump back to that section just very quickly, just to bring you back to what we saw. Size of the core market is almost doubling over the next year. That's massive growth. It's also maturing heavily. And we also saw it's not just about gut health, but broader topics around digestion, stomach ailments, and just living well, and sort of the broader also connects and links to, and again, for the purpose of this talk, I didn't want to go into all that nitty gritty, but it also links and connects to issues around inflammation, links and connects to issues around allergens and insensitivities and intolerances and so on and so forth. But ultimately, massive emerging demand space, certainly something that is offering short-term potential because of its growth. Now is the time to invest because it shows us that there's a potential for us to occupy a leadership position early on. The other opportunity is digestion as a whole that I talked about, but because the growth rate is much smaller and the market size is much smaller, it's more of a longer-term opportunity. Gut health is really front and center and something that is more short-term focused. Next, let's move on to some of the threats. The first one, nutritional deficiency. We talked about this. It's growing. It's not growing massively, but it's relevant to a much larger portion of the population, almost 50 million people. That's important because that's telling me that this is a huge barrier to the growth of the plant-based universe. So, if you're a meat producer, this could be good news. This could be something that you invest in from an innovation standpoint. If you're a plant-based producer, this is bad news. This is something you're going to invest in from, again, from an innovation, marketing, education standpoint. There are all kinds of opportunities here, but of course, the point here is to understand the cultural forces at play and the impact they could have. The next threat, like nutritional deficiency, is that of quality of meat. Again, we talked about how the quality of meat is engaging, and on one hand, it's making people go towards plant-based foods, but the reason we put it under a threat is because, on the other hand, it also opens the door for meat producers to innovate in this landscape. And we're certainly already starting to see that, and I can't go to which one of our clients is testing some of this stuff, but we're seeing, I just saw a report in Forbes about, specific producers testing IoT solutions where they can inform the consumer about not just where the meat comes from, but which farm, and if the consumer wants, they can educate themselves on how that farm, practices and what kinds of practices they use, and what they feed their animals, and how they treat their animals, and so on and so forth. So there's definitely innovation already starting to happen in this space. That is why I slot that into a threat, because the more meat producers innovate there, the more of a threat that becomes. And again, higher core market, higher market growth. So short-term threat, nutritional deficiency, quality of meat. Long-term, we've got two major threats. Again, long-term because they're growing at growing at a slower pace, or they're just much significantly smaller in core market at the moment. And those relate to pesticide use, which we talked about, and we talked about the concern over pesticides and organics as well. But again, very small core market, less than half the core market of plant-based. So that tells us that less than half of the plant-based consumer even understands or considers this as a concern. But again, it is growing, but it's not growing hand over fist. And then secondly, cultured lab-grown meat. Again, interesting demand space. It's low growth or nominal growth at the moment. We'll have to wait and watch. So it is definitely a longer-term threat as this becomes more popular and more accepted. But certainly at this point, this is not a short-term threat just because of where it sits in culture. And this is it. So this is really what teaches us about this plant-based universe. It helps us understand, and this is really what I mean. I started this presentation by talking about how our role as an organization is to help our clients go from an industry-derived or an industry-led lens to a consumer-led lens. And it's a very difficult thing, because it's very easy to say, I'm going to go do something based on industry data that I see or commoditized research that I see. And that's the easiest thing to do. It's the easiest thing to talk about as an executive. It's the easiest thing to talk about as a senior manager managing up, or an executive managing down. But it's not the right one, because it often leads you down the wrong strategy. And I pulled this slide up because I started with an example of a client that brought us in because their plant protein division was underperforming. And one of the first projects we did for them was to look at the plant protein landscape. And the first thing we discovered was that plant protein is completely an industry-created idea or notion. Veganism, yes, maybe a consumer-created notion, but plant protein is an industry-created notion. Really, when you dig into the plant protein universe, like we've done here, obviously here, I'm looking at this at more of a higher level, but just looking at some of these opportunities and threats, I can straight away see that, if I'm a major protein player in the United States, I shouldn't be creating a division focused on plant protein. What I really should be doing is creating a division focused on nutrition and quality. Why? Because nutrition and quality, and this is getting messy here, because nutrition and quality offer incredible opportunities if I'm a traditional pork and beef producer and one of the major players in that in the United States, because that helps me manage the threat of plant-based. It helps me innovate. And then if I am considering plant-based solutions to invest in, it helps me make sure that I invest in them through the lens of the consumer, not through the lens of the industry. So I'm investing in enhancing nutrition and enhancing quality of food rather than just delivering a plant protein solution. And of course, in the first 3 months of helping them understand this, the first thing the executives did is actually reframe the focus internally. So their division went from being called plant protein to being called nutrition and quality. And of course, in the 6 months following, they immediately changed, their fortunes in terms of not just the reaction they were getting from consumers for the things they were putting into market, but also their innovation cycle became so much richer. They saw better impacts. Their failure rate dropped significantly. And of course, the overall impact on business and net new revenue was significant as well. But this is really why we exist as a company, what gets us excited, what wakes us up in the morning, because this difference between an industry-led lens and a consumer-led lens is what makes or breaks innovation. It helps us reduce the abysmal rate of failure of innovations. And more importantly, in situations like this, it helps us think a bit more critically and move beyond buzzwords and move beyond sort of, what we would consider to be bubble-like descriptions of industries to actually understand what's really going on so that we don't, get mesmerized by industry definitions and articles in Forbes magazine, but instead focus on what's really going on for the consumer, why it's going on, and what we can do to address the why at the end of the day. And that's it. That's it for me. I think I kept up to my end of the bargain. We are 32 minutes in. My goal was to finish in about 30 minutes and give you all some time back. I do see there are a couple of questions that relate more specifically to our technology that, I would say please reach out to me. We can have those discussions offline. I think, certainly some of these are more sales-driven conversations that, I would prefer to have offline and not inundate everybody on this call. And my focus was really to talk about the value of this kind of research and, more importantly, present the work on the plant-based universe here. I do see one interesting question in the Q&A box around, trends that relate to plant-based that might be impacting plant-based. It's a really great question. Obviously, I wanted to keep the conversation a little more focused here, but every time we do an analysis, here's the benefit of doing, observational ethnography with big data. What happens is that when a machine is doing this kind of work and our team of anthropologists is relying on the machine, it forces our anthropologists to actually minimize human judgment, and instead all they have to do is follow the breadcrumbs that are laid out by the system. And these breadcrumbs are really what is laid out by the consumer in the organic manner in which they talk on the internet. So if the consumer associates a parallel trend or has a relationship on a parallel industry with plant-based, we will see that because the consumer has left us a breadcrumb. And the more significant that breadcrumb becomes in culture, the closer that sort of breadcrumb or that meaning becomes in semantic distance to the underlying topic we're searching for, and the more visible it becomes to our team and to the technology, and we're able to analyze it and understand what it means. So yes, the simple answer is yes, there are about 4 or 5 different parallel trends that are impacting plant-based, but plant-based is also impacting 4 or 5 other parallel trends. A couple of them I did bring up already, like I talked about inflammation. There's something really interesting going on around the whole idea of inflammation, intolerability or tolerability of food, and dairy connects to this significantly, and obviously the entire dairy industry and the protein industry has a very strong link to plant-based. So those are a couple of examples. We also see some really interesting examples in the whole universe of food as medicine, as in, people believing that certain types of foods obviously, impact mood, impact, mental wellness, mental well-being. Obviously, there's a lot of interesting research around this, and it's talked about a lot. So another parallel industry that is certainly connected to plant-based, but more on the fringes at the moment and emerging. And there are many such other trends that is not top of mind for me at the moment. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole point about us being able to do agile research this way. To give you an example, when we do deep dive research projects like these for our clients, because it's technology enabled, we can do them in 3 to 5 business days. And a lot of the quick results we can generate in seconds. And it's so powerful because it allows us to create the sense of agility so our clients don't have to put their industry lens when they're scoping research. They can just tell us about what business challenges they have, and we can let the consumer kind of guide us in understanding how to frame the research, what breadcrumbs to follow, identifying the demand spaces that really impact that, and determining where there's growth or where the threats and opportunities really lie. So that's really the fascinating and the interesting part for us that we get super interested about and excited about it anytime we do this kind of work. So another really interesting question. A lot of people talk about the environment as being a big concern for plant-based Do you agree, disagree? So great question. So, and actually thank you for bringing that up, because I did have it in my notes to talk about this and I almost forgot about it. Here's the interesting thing. We see this in a lot of categories or a lot of industries where morality or moral judgment comes into play when, a certain purchase decision is involved. Politics is a great example of that. Sounding socially progressive, great, hip thing to do. We've seen the impact of that in the last election in the United States. This is another case where morality and moral judgment comes into play. So, in fact, again, I didn't go into all this gory detail here, but if I quickly run a search on MotivBase, you'll see that the dominant motivation the dominant driving force behind plant-based is this whole motivation of wanting to be morally right or on the right side of history from a moral standpoint. So people are motivated to not be judged for their morality. And so the obvious excuse is environmental sustainability. And oftentimes, any research you do where you interview people, you talk to people, everybody talks about the environment. The challenge is that when you actually look at data, and again, this is observational ethnography, right? We're not putting people into a panel and having them discuss something. We're just scraping millions of conversations on the internet about anything and everything. And in this case, we're looking at hundreds of thousands of conversations people are having around plant-based organically. They're just having them because it's of interest to them and of interest in their lives. In those conversations, the environment sits in the far fringes. It's not the central driving force, and it is not it's not a dominant demand space. It always sits in the background, always sits as a justification. So it's just really fascinating for us because, it not only obviously does it have an impact on marketing and communications, but it has such a large impact on innovation because people don't realize, and you invest all this money on something without realizing that ultimately doesn't drive the purchase decision. I think that's it. A couple more specific questions about the technology and our pricing that I don't want to talk about here. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to discuss that. And by the way, there's my email, ujwal@motivbase.com. Feel free to reach out and I'll make sure that somebody from my team gets back in touch with you. Thanks, everybody. I think we're going to end here. I will certainly make sure to send out the recording here. Please look for an email from someone from my team with that. Hope you have a great rest of the week and a great evening. Bye-bye.